There's a moment every farmer knows. The fuel bowser is low. The paddock still needs turning. And the decision, do you go now or wait? That decision has consequences you can measure in tonnes. Australia is in that moment right now. Except it's not just the fuel. The fertiliser's also running short. The price has already moved. Supermarket shelves soon to be empty. And the people who would normally do the work, they were already disappearing before any of this started. 3 inputs, 3 supply chains under pressure simultaneously. And most of Australians don't know any of it. I'm Todd Crowley. This is Intelligence Optimised. My guest today grew up on the land, served in the Australian Army, and has spent her career reporting on agriculture, food security and national security. Not as separate subjects, but as one problem. Kate Banville doesn't see these as different beats. By the end of this conversation, you won't either. Kate, there's a supply chain instinct that you develop in the military. Did that sharpen your eye for agricultural vulnerability?
Probably if I did put some thought into it, the influence came more from my father, who was an electrician, who was, that was his bread and butter, was keeping these farming operations running and powered. And so I think you notice things without actually having a reference point or a policy document. You just know that there's a cause and effect. And so, yes, I started to join those dots as I continued through my journalism career and was able to connect them in a more meaningful way that links back to those structures. But I think really it just came from the fact that, if the generator goes off, then whatever it is in front of you is no longer powered, whether you're in a field environment or, in a military environment, or if you're inside a farming operation or even just in a community. When the power goes off, the power is off.
Yeah. And so it's that lived experience and that instinct.
I would say so.
Yeah. Kate, what do people who cover agriculture from the city consistently miss that you see?
Well, that's an interesting question in itself, because by design, we don't have agricultural reporters based in city centres when we have a lot of agricultural business done in city centres, but all of the rural and ag reporters that work for major networks and outlets are all in the regions that they represent.
Yeah. It's a very important point. It's the eyes and ears and the pulse. So there's a framing I want to come back to later, which is food sovereignty. And it gets used as a feel-good concept, buy local, reduce food miles. But I want to think that, the real sovereignty question is about inputs, not produce. And we'll get there. But I want to run into, the entry point here. And let's start with fuel, because it's the visible pressure right now. We covered the strategic picture with Paddy Hallinan in our last episode, and today with you, I want the farm gate picture. 25 days of diesel. What does that actually mean on a farm? But not as a statistic, but operationally.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, as a journalist and as a communicator and a facilitator of conversations, it's very uncomfortable for me to be on the other side of the microphone. So I'm definitely not overstating my expertise in this area, because there are a lot of great minds within Australia across policy, academia, industry, that have been the people that inform my work. So this is not the world according to Kate's expertise. This is definitely from observation and just reporting experience. And it's nice doing this with you, Todd, because I'm really treating it like we're just swapping notes in a lot of ways, given the platform that you have with Vaxa, but also just that I recognize this is not only timely, people are deeply curious about what is actually happening. How do we demystify or translate or make sense of the statistics which you pointed to? But to your question about sovereignty, well, I would ask the counter question to that of what what's the meaning you're applying to that? In what context and to who?
Yeah, well, and that yeah, that's a good point as well. So, yeah, we have a look at what our country has the ability to produce locally, or has done for the has the ability for the last 80 years to become truly sovereign. And when we talk about a supply chain perspective, with inputs. So, what inputs do we rely on from other nations that have to come here by sea or air to help us create something? So, when I look at food sovereignty, well, food, we require energy to grow the food, and that includes, diesel. That includes other inputs like fertilizer. It's now starting to include things like labor with the palm scheme. What though? What can we cut out of that importing supply chain to be able to develop our own food systems here in Australia? Um, so you're talking about things like that farm gate picture. If we're stuck with, or if we've only got 25 days of diesel, there's a reason for that. It's because we're based on a just-in-time supply chain here in Australia. We're not creating or refining any of our raw product into end user product, and that's a challenge, and that's what we're seeing today, and what we're going to see, the physical reality on farms, especially. We talk about food security and national security being intertwined in this country, and people are about to see why that is the case. So when things like, irrigation machinery, refrigeration, they're all diesel dependent. So we don't create enough diesel here into to be able to make those machines keep running when we get to a point where we are. So that's the food, that's the sovereignty piece that I'm referring to there.
Absolutely. And I think with that explanation alone, we could both agree that we're not sovereign
No,
in that space.
that's right. That's right.
By definition, we are not only just in time, which we have been for far too long, but we are dependent. And so, by the definition of sovereignty, in that context, we're not sovereign. I started talking about food security and national security as the same thing years ago in at conferences that I was hosting or panel discussions. And I can tell you very confidently and clearly that only a few years ago, saying and positioning these topics as being not just intertwined or dependent, but critically the same, that food security is national security, energy security is national security, critical infrastructure is national security. Um, that was quite a tin foil hat concept. And the mindset shift has been quite rapid in a lot of ways. And so that's promising because we're thinking about these things in different ways. And so that also says to me that everything starts with the mindset of how we try to understand these issues, but then also tackle the challenges that come with it.
Oh, 100%. And like you said, there's a lot of people that have been talking about this for a long time. And we spoke about this in our last episode with Patty. Patty and I have been talking about it to government and to other large companies, that we have a fuel security problem in this country since 2011. We were talking about it. John Blackburn's been talking about it for a very long time. Yeah, the average person in the street.
Gosh, you just I at this point, I consider, John a bit of a national treasure because if we didn't have minds like his that were talking about this now, being able to put a face and a voice to this very credible information that he presents, I mean, there would be another void of expertise. But also, he's been talking about this for years.
And that's the challenge, right? There's some wonderful minds that have been talking about it for a very long time, but no one's listened or done anything about it. And that's why we see ourselves in this position today. And it is very easy to sit back and throw stones and go, well, I told you. But, and we're at that point now, and we will see it, sooner rather than later, where, the average person on the street is going to start feeling it. And that's when, the politicians, whether they're, but are they thinking about their next election, or are they actually thinking about the people they represent? Now's a really good, it's a stake in the ground. There's an opportunity for our leaders to make a difference right now. I mean, I look at, Kate, we export, Australia exports food to 3 times of our population. We're a food producing nation, but we're almost entirely dependent on imported fuel to do it. We're imported foreign flag ships to bring those here as well. I mean, how do we end up in this paradox?
A political setting and a leadership setting, which you alluded to, I think. And I guess that's another moment to raise that question of sovereignty. What does that mean in our political setting? Because as you rightly said, we are an export nation, and not only do we depend on that economically, there's also a responsibility because it's food. And so those countries that are importing, if they can't feed their nation, that becomes an entirely different issue for them, that they're thinking in ways that we probably need to apply to our thinking when it comes to fuel security.
100%. We've seen Xi do it in China. They've been in drought. 40% of their country's been in drought for a long time. But they realise that 1.2 billion hungry people creates uprising. Well, however many million people here in Australia without food, that has the ability to create anarchy. Given if there's not going to be any food on our shelves, and that's obviously what we're trying to avoid here. Fuel. I don't know how seriously that. With 2 operating refineries, one at Lytton and one in Geelong, so they're both on the East Coast, and they're both on government support until 2030. So what does that tell you, how seriously Australia has treated fuel as a food security input?
And the simple answer to that is we haven't. I mean, we haven't even treated it as a priority for our defence force. So I think there's a reprioritization that's occurring when it comes to fuel in real time. And it's just a shame that it's not even a just in time situation. It's now a a crisis point situation. But just to that point, I guess, about the role of politicians and how that also links to social, what was the word you used before?
Anarchy? Did I use?
Yeah, I mean, I would be very concerned if we got to the point of anarchy, and that's the worst case scenario. And I have enough faith in our political leaders, not necessarily because of the individual people, but because of the system and the constitution and the functioning of government that we have, that we should not get to a point of anarchy. But we've also got a bit of a framework that they can draw on from COVID, because we thought that was the worst possible situation, with lockdowns, with a whole, rationing of a whole bunch of things within the health system. And I'm sure you could talk directly to that. It was a different use case, but we really aren't implementing any of those lessons learnt from COVID, which tells me they're not lessons. They're still a problem set. But when it comes to potential solutions to this, unlike nations that are totally reliant on imports, we've got options when it comes to fuel. And so, why aren't we using our political structure to draw on those levers? Because we actually have options that other nations don't.
And I think that's one of the challenges with our federated system here in Australia. But today, as we're talking, national cabinets meeting, so we should hear something. By the time our listeners get to hear this, there should be some framework or way forward. Well, let's hope. But Kate, look, let's leave fuel there for a moment, because I think most people, including most people covering this story, and that haven't connected yet, that fuel's not the only input that's broken here. 91% of Australia's fertiliser is imported. Two-thirds of our urea, the dominant nitrogen input, 44% of what we use comes from the Middle East. That's through the same Hormuz choke point. So since March, urea prices have already risen 55%. The peak body, Fertiliser Australia, wrote to the federal government on the 17th of March, warning of, and I'm paraphrasing, catastrophic impacts on agricultural output for 2026 season if disruptions continue. So I guess my question, when did fertiliser start feeling like a national security issue to you? Was it recent, or have you been watching this coming with your stories that you've been covering for a number of years in the ag space?
I've not only been watching it, I've been reporting on it. So this is not new at all. Just thinking back to, one of the first sort of shock points that we were able to really use as this case study, because it seems we need a case study for everything instead of just watching the trends as they develop and preventing them to getting to that point of a case study. The immediate shock after Russia invading Ukraine, phosphate is not an infinite mineral, but it is incredibly important for fertilizer. Fertilizer is it's been an issue for a long time.
He's the owner of Northwest Phosphate, and they've got some major deposits up near the Mount Isa region. They have been lobbying government to help them with the right permits to be able to dig that product out of the ground, but also to process it here. So to help out the Mount Isa community, given that Glencore have let them down, there's a whole lot of facilities up there that would allow Northwest Phosphate to not only dig up but produce product that could stay within the Australian market. Do you think they've had much luck?
I don't even think that's a question. Your listeners will know the answer to that, because it's the same answer that applies across a lot of these topics that we're talking about. And it goes back to that very point that you made. We are an import dependent nation for a lot of those commodities and inputs. But I would just go back to the point that I will continue to go back to. Unlike other import dependent nations, we have levers that we can pull. And so this is a policy setting conversation in my mind.
Yeah, yeah, and that takes a bit of time and lobbying. But can you help me understand? There's a bit of a, in my mind, there's a timing problem because, this isn't just a price issue. So wheat, barley, canola, these have narrow fertilizer application windows. So if the product doesn't arrive in time, you don't pay more, you lose a whole season. So in your mind, how close are we to that threshold in the current cropping calendar?
We're in it. Speaking to farmers just in the last few days, if they didn't have their fertilizer order in months ago and have their fertilizer stocks ready to use, the delays will mean that they've missed that season, but they're also rationing and stockpiling their own inputs. And so it's not just a case of a window for planting or application of fertilizer. They're making real time decisions knowing that they're not planting as much because they have to try and forecast rising costs of inputs or just complete inaccessibility to those inputs. The other part of it is who will be buying their produce when it's ready to go to market, when all of the economic and financial shocks are hitting the households and they're making decisions about where they spend their money. And this is something that the agricultural community across commodities knows all too well, because human behavior changes in crisis.
It sure does. And I guess even though, if there's an upstream product, what are the downstream effects as well? So and by that I mean you've got a finished product on the shelves. Well, mum and dad are going to miss out on that even over time. So it takes a while for that product to end up in a finished product. But the other big thing too, in my mind, is, well, if this shock continues, if the efforts in the Middle East continue, what ships are going to come here? Ships will come here only if they're bringing product in, and if they've got a backload. But what product are they going to be bringing in? So to me, it's a bit of a challenge. But from a farmer's point of view, and understanding all the various inputs that go into farming and agribusiness, and this is, I guess, where they're intrinsically aligned, is, well, you can have all the fertilizer, but you also need the diesel to spread the fertilizer in your farm machinery. And I can see why, some farmers have been, stocking up on diesel, and, maybe there needs to be a bit more of an effort there or support from the government. I guess, well, not only in the messaging, in the reason why, diesel stocks have gone down significantly the last few weeks. Well, it's because farmers are needing to stockpile it. And Gus McLaughlin actually mentioned this on a heavily rivaled podcast, Carl Stefanovic. He might have one or two more listeners, but he spoke about that as well, and making it to normalise that in mums and dads' eyes, that this is really important. But I guess with the input that go into farming, there's a second layer, and I find it particularly interesting, is that Australia imports 99% of its ammonium sulfate from China, almost all urea from the Middle East. Both supply chains are simultaneously under pressure. Do you think that's a coincidence, or is it, a structural design failure?
That's a really tricky question, because I think the subtext of coincidence or structural failure is that there would be some kind of intent. And I probably see it quite differently, in that it's because there's been a lack of intentional thought and application.
And do you think that's based on an election cycle?
Without a doubt. And I think we have a tendency as humans, and, groupthink and populations, particularly within, you know, democratic structures like ours, is we rightly look to our political leaders for answers, because they've been charged with the job to govern our country in our best interests and deliver on what we've voted for. The challenge there is when we resort immediately to our political leaders with the notion that we'll kick out the government of the day in the next election cycle, and we'll turn all of our votes to this party, and then they'll come in and they'll fix it. Actually, we have an opportunity, and we saw it in action during COVID, is that we can pressure test our government, the functioning of government. We can pull on those levers to actually have a national cabinet meeting or have reform. And I'm not saying that we should be rushing reform, but that's actually what the function of government is: to govern and reform. So instead of focusing on an election cycle and us as the voters turning all of our rage and attention to a political party of whatever persuasion that aligns with your political positions, we could turn our attention to the actual functioning of government.
I think there's some good examples in history that show where leaders actually, I guess, had the foresight of nation building. And, Winston Churchill's one of them, Margaret Thatcher's another, Abraham Lincoln, he was another as well, where they weren't necessarily worried about an election cycle, but they were worried about getting on with building a nation. Leads me to a point. Do you think there's anyone in Canberra right now that they're treating fertiliser as the strategic input that it is, the way they might treat semiconductors or rare earths? Or, do you think it's still falling through the gap between an agriculture portfolio and a security portfolio?
Well, I'd be quite confident in saying that it's not been placed in a security portfolio, and I'm quite comfortable in saying that fuel has not been placed in agriculture portfolio. I would hope it is now, but for a long time. And so I guess that's back to the point that we both started with, that these things are actually intertwined. And until we start approaching the policy setting as though it is intertwined, then we will just continue to have a decision problem, which is what we've got. But that also means we have a reform opportunity.
Maybe it's the failure we need. But I guess what's this is what sort of strikes me, Kate, is we've got a national conversation going at the moment about fuel security, partial, inadequate, but at least it exists. The fertiliser conversation is barely happening, and yet both inputs flow through the same choke point. Both are now under price and supply pressure simultaneously, and the policy response to each is calibrated completely differently. I'll leave that with you to think about, but I want to move into another really critical input into the agri supply chain. That's labour. It's what I've termed as the third input. If this conversation helps, give the show a quick rating on Spotify, Apple, or your platform of choice. It really does move the needle.